History is filled with silences, not the quiet peace between moments, but the loud, unnerving silence of a story left unfinished. It is the silence of a ship found adrift with no crew, the silence of a colony that vanishes overnight, and the chilling silence of a military outpost that simply stops reporting in. For the men of the British Empire during the 19th century, such silences from the fringes of their vast dominion were a constant source of dread, a sign that the thin veneer of order they had imposed upon an ancient land had been violently torn away. In the dusty, leather-bound archives of the British Indian Army, there are countless files detailing patrols that never returned and garrisons that disappeared. Most were the tragic, but understandable, results of ambushes, disease, or rebellion, the expected costs of empire. But some of these files end not with a conclusion, but with a question mark. They speak of forts found eerily empty, with no signs of battle, no bodies, and no rational answers. This is the story of one such silence. It is drawn from the pages of a lost, unofficial journal allegedly belonging to a British officer sent to discover the fate of a remote fort in the treacherous Khyber Pass region. His official report, filed upon his supposed return, cited plague and mass desertion. But what was written in the stained, frantic pages of his private journal told a different, far more terrifying story. It was not a story of men, but of monsters. It was a story of a place where modern military discipline was devoured by an ancient, hungry darkness. Peshawar, 1897. The city was a dusty, chaotic jewel set at the edge of the Hindu Kush Mountains, an outpost of the British Empire and the gateway to the volatile northwest frontier. For the British officers stationed at the sprawling military cantonment, it was the very edge of the civilized world. Beyond it lay the tribal territories, a land of barren, unforgiving mountains, fiercely independent warriors, and a complex web of allegiances that the British had been trying, and failing, to master for decades. This was the front line of the Great Game. The shadowy Cold War being waged between Britain and Tsarist Russia for the control of Central Asia. Captain Alistair Finch of the 35th Sikhs was a product of this era. He was a man built of straight lines and solid certainties, his mind shaped by the rigid logic of the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. He believed in the immutable power of the rifle, the absolute discipline of the drill square, and the unquestionable moral and technological superiority of the British way of life. He was a good officer, brave, competent, and respected by his men. But he viewed the local culture and its beliefs with a detached, almost clinical sense of imperial amusement. To him, the stories of jinns, spirits, and ghouls whispered by his native sepoy troops were nothing more than the charming, if primitive, superstitions of a lesser-educated people. He was a man of the modern, rational world. He had no time for ghosts. On a sweltering August morning, as the sun began to bake the city, Finch was summoned to the office of his commanding officer, a grim-faced colonel whose desk was a fortress of maps and paperwork. The colonel, a man not known for wasting words, got straight to the point. Fort Sparrowhawk had gone silent. It was a small but strategically vital outpost deep in the Khyber region, an eagle's nest of stone and mud perched high in the mountains, manned by a company of 50 souls, a mix of British regulars and local Pashtun riflemen. For 3 weeks, not a single word had been heard from them. No heliograph flashes from the signaling tower, no runner with a message pouch, just a complete unnerving and absolute silence. The colonel suspected a well-coordinated ambush by local Afridi tribesmen. Captain Finch's orders were clear. Take a platoon of his most trusted Sikh and Pashtun soldiers, ride to the fort, re-establish contact by any means necessary, and report back on the situation. It was a mission Finch had performed a dozen times before. As Finch prepared his small expeditionary force of 30 men, a sense of quiet unease settled over his native troops. He noticed them tying small, protective silver amulets to their equipment and murmuring quiet prayers as they checked their rifles. He was about to reprimand them for such unsoldierly behavior when his second-in-command, a veteran Pashtun officer named Jemadar Rizwan Khan, approached him. Jemadar Khan was a man as old and hard as the mountains themselves, his face a leathery canvas of scars and deep lines. He was fiercely loyal to the crown, having fought in a dozen campaigns under the Union Jack, but his loyalty did not erase the ancient beliefs and fears of his people. He stood before Finch, his expression clouded with genuine concern. In a low voice, he said to the captain, "Sahib, the men are afraid." Finch, meticulously checking the strap on his holster, did not look up from his task. "Afraid of what, Jemadar? Afridi raiders? We've dealt with them before. They are men, and they bleed like any other." "No, Sahib," Khan replied, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "They are not afraid of men. They are afraid of the place itself. Fort Sparrowhawk was built on bad ground, a place of much bloodshed, long before the British came. The elders say it is a place of the Pishacha." Finch finally looked at him, one eyebrow raised in clinical amusement. "Pishocha, what is that? Some kind of local bogeyman to frighten children?" Jemadar Khan's dark, weathered eyes were deadly serious. He did not smile. "They are not stories for children, Sahib. They are ghouls. Demons that feed on the flesh of men and haunt places of great slaughter. They are drawn to the scent of fear and death. The men say the garrison at Sparrowhawk did not just die, they were eaten." Finch let out a short, sharp, incredulous laugh. "Jemadar, you are a soldier of the Queen, a man who wears her uniform and carries her rifle. You cannot possibly believe in such childish nonsense. The garrison was likely ambushed or has succumbed to cholera. We will find a rational explanation for this silence. Now, see to the men." We ride out within the hour, and Jemadar Khan simply brought his heels together, gave a crisp salute, his face a stoic mask. But his eyes held a deep, lingering fear that Captain Finch, in his fortress of rational Western arrogance, completely failed to see. The journey from the relative civilization of Peshawar into the heart of the Khyber Pass was like a descent into another, more ancient world. The dusty, bustling plains gave way to a landscape of towering, barren mountains that clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. The air grew thin and cold despite the oppressive sun. The world was a stark, brutal palette of brown and gray rock, a place seemingly devoid of life, save for the occasional circling vulture high above, a black speck against the pale, washed-out blue. Captain Finch led his platoon of 30 men up the narrow, winding trail that snaked its way through the mountains like a scar. The only sounds were the rhythmic clatter of their horses' hooves on the loose rock and the low, mournful whistling of the wind as it moved through the deep ravines. It was a land of brutal contrasts, a place that felt profoundly hostile to human existence, a place that seemed to actively resist their presence. As they rode deeper into the frontier, Finch noticed a marked and unsettling change in his men. The usual easy chatter and camaraderie of the march had evaporated, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. The sepoy troops, both the proud Sikhs and the hardened Pashtuns, rode with their Martini Henry rifles held ready across their saddles, their eyes constantly scanning the jagged ridgelines above. They were not just looking for the glint of an enemy Jezzail barrel anymore. They were looking for something else, something their captain had dismissed as fantasy. In his journal, which he dutifully wrote in each evening by the light of a flickering campfire, Finch noted his growing frustration with their behavior. "The men are on edge," he wrote. "Every shadow seems to hold a phantom. Every gust of wind sounds like a whisper. Jemadar Khan's ridiculous stories have poisoned their minds with fear. I find myself having to constantly assert my authority to keep them from performing their little rituals for protection. This is the army, not a temple. Discipline must be maintained, especially out here. And yet, I must confess the silence of this place is unnerving. It presses in on you from all sides. It feels as though the mountains themselves are watching your every move with a cold and ancient indifference." On the third day of their arduous journey, they entered a narrow pass known locally as the Jaws of the Devil. The sheer rock walls rose hundreds of feet on either side of the trail, so close that in some places, the men could reach out and touch both sides with outstretched arms. The path was shrouded in a permanent, gloomy twilight even at midday. It was here in this claustrophobic corridor of stone that they found the first sign that something was deeply and unnaturally wrong. Scraped into the hard granite of the pass walls, about 10 feet up from the trail floor, were a series of long, deep gouges. They were not made by any tool Finch recognized, nor were they the marks of natural erosion. They looked like claw marks, but they were far too large and had been carved with too much force to have been made by any known animal in the region. Not a snow leopard, not a bear. It looked as if something immense, armed with iron-like talons, had dragged its claws down the length of the rock, leaving behind a warning or a territorial marker, and dismounted the column to halt and dismounted to examine them. The marks were old, but not ancient. Their edges were still relatively sharp beneath a thin layer of dust. He ran a gloved hand over them, a strange, profound coldness seeping into his fingertips. A cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The sepoy troops refused to get close, their horses becoming skittish, their eyes rolling in terror as they shied away from the marked walls. Jem'Hadar Khan came to stand beside his captain, his face ashen, his hand instinctively touching the silver amulet he wore beneath his uniform. He pointed a trembling finger at the marks. "It's a bad omen, Sahib," he said, his voice strained and barely audible above the wind. "It is a sign. The Pashocha marks its territory. It is telling us to go no further. We should turn back." Finch gritted his teeth, his patience wearing thin, using his anger to mask the sliver of fear that was now twisting in his own gut. "It is erosion, Jem'Hadar. Wind and water carving the rock over centuries. Nothing more. Get the men in order. We press on." But even as he gave the order, even as he forced his mind to cling to a rational explanation, Finch could not shake the image of those claw marks. Wind and water did not create patterns of such deliberate, violent power. He mounted his horse and spurred it forward, leading his men out of the pass. But for the first time on the journey, he felt a genuine, undeniable fear, a cold doubt that began to chip away at the formidable fortress of his rational British mind. They rode for another day, the atmosphere growing heavier and more oppressive with each passing mile. So, they finally crested a high, wind-swept ridge, and there below them, nestled in a desolate bowl of rock like a skull in the palm of a giant hand, was Fort Sparrowhawk. From a distance, it looked perfectly intact. The formidable stone walls were solid, the Union Jack still fluttering defiantly from the flagpole in the center of the courtyard. But there was no smoke from the chimneys, no sentries walking the walls. The entire fort was bathed in an unnatural, profound silence. Finch raised his field glasses to his eyes, his hands strangely unsteady. The main gate was slightly ajar, swinging gently, rhythmically, back and forth in the wind. A wave of dread washed over him, colder and sharper than the mountain air itself. Something was terribly wrong. He gave the order to advance, his hand resting on the comforting, familiar grip of his Webley revolver. He and his men were about to ride down into a place that was no longer a fort, but a tomb. The approach to Fort Sparrowhawk was unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the incessant, mournful moan of the wind as it moved through the empty battlements. Captain Finch ordered half his men, including the nervous horse handlers, to remain outside and establish a secure perimeter. He, along with Jem'Hadar Khan and a dozen of his best Sikh and Pashtun soldiers, would enter the fort to investigate. Their boots crunched on the loose gravel of the path, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead silence. The heavy wooden gate, scarred by the sun and wind, creaked open under Finch's push, revealing the central courtyard. It was deserted. An eerie, expectant stillness hung over the place, a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight on their shoulders. There were no bodies, no bloodstains on the dusty ground, no signs of a battle. But the scene before them was a perfect chilling tableau of a life interrupted with unnatural, terrifying suddenness. A half-eaten meal of chapati and dal sat on a long wooden table outside the mess hall. The food now a desiccated, hardened mass crawling with flies. A game of chess was left unfinished on a small, overturned ammunition crate, the wooden pieces scattered in the dust as if the players had simply vanished mid-move. Inside the armory, dozens of Martini Henry rifles were neatly stacked in their racks, untouched, their barrels gleaming with a fresh coat of oil. In the barracks, rough wool blankets were thrown back on the rope cots, as if their occupants had just been startled from their sleep. On a small desk in the corner, a soldier's letter home to his wife in Liverpool lay half-written, the ink dried in the nib of the pen. The letter began, "My dearest Mary, the heat here is unbearable, but the nights are cold. I miss you terribly," and it ended there. It was as if all 50 men of the garrison had simply evaporated into thin air. Finch's men moved through the fort with a mixture of professional caution and primal dread. The proud Sikh soldiers, renowned for their bravery, now clutched their rifles tightly, their eyes wide as they scanned the empty doorways and shadowed corners. The battle-hardened Pashtun troops murmured prayers under their breath, their hands strained to the protective amulets hidden beneath their uniforms. Jem'Hadar Khan's face was a mask of grim certainty. He had known they would find something like this. This was not the work of men. Finch, however, clung desperately to his logic, his mind racing, searching for any rational explanation that could fit the impossible scene. A disease, he wrote in his journal that evening, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the dead commander's office. It must be cholera or some other swift and terrible plague. They must have panicked, the healthy ones deserted, leaving the sick to their fate. But where are the bodies? There should be bodies, a mass grave at least hastily dug. But there is nothing, only this awful watching silence. He had made his way to the commander's office, hoping to find answers. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was in perfect military order except for the regimental logbook lying open on the desk. The previous commander, a Major Davies, was a man Finch knew by reputation as a meticulous and unemotional officer, but the last few entries in the log were anything but. The entries, dated over the 3 weeks of the fort's silence, charted a descent into madness. The first few mentioned a growing unease among the native troops who were complaining of strange noises at night. Major Davies had dismissed these reports with an air of frustration, writing it off as the usual local superstition. A week later, the tone of the entries shifted. Davies wrote of a strange sickness spreading through the garrison, a sickness that caused not fever or physical ailment, but a deep, unshakable dread and a gnawing paranoia. Men were reporting seeing things in the shadows, hearing whispers on the wind. Davies then wrote of a terrible smell that seemed to come and go with the night, a smell like old, spoiled meat, but with a strange, cloying, coppery undertone. The second to last entry was a single, frantic, almost illegible line. The sepoys are calling it the hunger. God help us, I think I hear it too. The scraping never stops. The final entry, dated the last day any contact was made with the outside world, was just a single scrawled word. The ink was smudged as if written by a hand trembling so violently it could barely hold the pen. The word was hunger. Finch slammed the book shut, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. This was not cholera. This was something else. He ordered his men to conduct a final thorough search of every building, every storeroom, every corner of the fort. They found nothing. No hidden graves, no secret tunnels, no sign of what had happened to the 50 men of the garrison. As dusk began to settle over the mountains, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping claws across the courtyard, Finch made a difficult but necessary decision. It was too late and too dangerous to ride back in the dark. They would have to secure the fort and spend the night within its accursed walls. He posted double sentries on the 4 corners of the fort and ordered the rest of the men to barricade themselves in the main barracks building. Jem'Hadar Khan approached him one last time, his face pleading, his usual military discipline forgotten in the face of his primal fear. "Sahib, we cannot stay here," he urged, his voice a strained whisper. "This place is cursed. The sun is setting. When the darkness comes, the Pashocha will wake. It knows we are here. It is hungry. It is enough, Jem'Hadar." Finch snapped, his own barely suppressed fear making him angry. "We are soldiers of the Queen, not frightened children cowering from fairy tales. We will hold this fort until dawn. We will be safe behind these walls. Post the sentries. That is a direct order." Jem'Hadar Khan said nothing more. He simply bowed his head and went to carry out his captain's orders. But as Finch watched him go, he couldn't escape the suffocating feeling that the thick stone walls around them were not a fortress. They were a trap. And they had just locked themselves inside with the monster. The night that followed would be the longest and last of Captain Alistair Finch's life. As the final sliver of sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks, a profound darkness and a chilling silence fell over the fort. It was a sound that scraped at the very edges of hearing, a sound that felt ancient and filled with an unspeakable, patient malice. The sepoy troops huddled together in the barracks, their faces pale and slick with sweat in the flickering lantern light. Finch tried to maintain a facade of calm, pacing the floorboards, but even he could feel the hair on his arms and the back of his neck standing on end. The first man vanished just before midnight. He was a young Sikh soldier, barely 20 years old, posted as a sentry on the north wall alongside a more experienced corporal. One moment he was there, a solid, turbaned silhouette against the faint starlight. The next, he was gone. The corporal, his back turned for only a single fatal second to scan the opposite direction, heard nothing, heard nothing. No scream, no struggle, no sound of a fall, just a sudden, absolute and impossible app. He spun around to find an empty space on the wall where his companion had stood just a moment before. All that remained was the man's Martini Henry rifle, leaning peacefully against the stone parapet, a silent testament to his sudden departure. Panic, raw and unreasoning, erupted. The corporal's terrified shouts echoed through the silent fort, bringing Finch and Jemadar Khan running up the stone steps to the battlements. A frantic search of the wall and the hard, rocky ground below revealed nothing. There were no tracks, no blood, no sign of what could have taken a full-grown man so silently and so completely from a guarded wall. Finch's rational mind scrambled desperately for an explanation. A desertion? Had the young soldier simply lost his nerve, silently climbed down the wall, and fled into the darkness? It seemed impossible. He was a good soldier, known for his steadfastness. But it was more believable than the alternative that was now being whispered fearfully among the surviving sepoys. The Pashocha had claimed its first victim. Finch doubled the sentries, ordering them to stand back to back, to never take their eyes off each other for even a second. Discipline, he told himself again and again, was their only shield against this creeping, unseen terror. But as the night wore on, that shield began to crack and splinter under an unbearable pressure. The whispers on the wind grew louder, close. They were no longer just a faint hissing on the edge of perception. They were becoming words, spoken in a guttural, ancient tongue that no one recognized. A language that felt fundamentally wrong to human ear. And mixed with the whispers was another, more terrifying sound. A faint rhythmic scraping like stone grinding slowly against stone. It seemed to be coming from inside the thick stone walls of the barracks itself. The men pressed their ears against the cold stone, their faces masks of pure horror. Jemadar Khan looked at Finch, his eyes wide with a terror that bordered on madness. "Sahib, they are in the walls," he hissed. Just as the major wrote in his book, "They are coming out." It was then that they found the new marks. Inside the barracks, on the thick stone walls that had stood for half a century, were fresh, deep gouges. They were the same claw-like marks they had seen in the mountain pass, only these were new, the stone beneath them pale and raw. It looked as if something had been trying to claw its way out from within the solid rock. This was the moment Captain Finch's composure, his entire worldview, finally and completely broke. The world of logic and reason, the world he had built his entire life upon, crumbled into dust. The claw marks, the whispers, the vanishing sentry, it was all impossible, and yet it was all happening. He was no longer a British officer in control of a military situation. He was a terrified man, a piece of meat trapped in a cage with a predator he could not see or understand. He drew his Webley revolver, its familiar, solid weight, a small and insignificant comfort in the overwhelming darkness. He gathered his remaining men in the center of the courtyard, forming a tight, desperate, circular perimeter. And they stood back to back, their rifles pointed out into the oppressive shadows of the fort, waiting for the dawn that now felt a lifetime away. The scraping from the walls stopped. The whispers ceased. An even deeper, more terrifying silence fell over Fort Sparrowhawk. And then they heard it. A sound that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their short lives. It was the sound of a low, dry, mocking laughter, and it echoed from the empty battlements all around them. Suddenly, with a deafening boom that shook the very foundations of the fort, the main gate slammed shut. A massive iron bar, too heavy for any single man to lift, fell into place on the other side with a final booming clang sealing them in. They were trapped. The laughter grew louder, closer. It was joined by the sound of something heavy and unseen dragging itself across the dusty courtyard towards them. The men began to panic, their discipline shattering. Some started firing blindly into the shadows. "Hold your fire!" Finch screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "There's nothing there! You're wasting ammunition!" But there was something there. In the fleeting, strobing light of the muzzle flashes, he saw them. For just a fraction of a second, he caught a glimpse of what was hunting them. Yorbi. They were tall, gaunt figures, their limbs impossibly long and thin, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. They were the color of old yellowed bone, their skin stretched tight and translucent over their skeletal frames. And their eyes glowed with a faint, malevolent, hungry red light. They were not ghosts. They were solid. They were real. And they were hungry. The last entry in Captain Alistair Finch's journal was written in these final, terrifying moments. His handwriting, usually so neat and controlled, was a frantic, almost illegible scrawl that tore across the page. They are all around us now. Khan was right. God forgive my pride. He was right. They are not men. They are hunger given form. I can see their eyes in the dark. So many eyes. The men are screaming. I have one bullet left in my Webley. It is not for them. It is for me. May God have mercy on my soul. The journal of Captain Alistair Finch ends there on a note of absolute despair. A month later, a larger British military column, a full company strong, was dispatched from Peshawar to investigate the prolonged silence of 2 garrisons. They arrived at Fort Sparrowhawk to find it just as Finch had, completely silent and eerily empty. The main gate was barred shut from the inside. After using explosives to force it open, they found no signs of Captain Finch or any of his 30 men. All that was discovered was Finch's small, leather-bound journal lying in the thick dust of the central courtyard as if left there deliberately for someone to find. The official report of the British Indian Army, filed in a neat, orderly ledger back in the safety of Peshawar, concluded the original garrison had likely succumbed to a sudden and virulent outbreak of plague, and that the local sepoys had deserted into the hostile wilderness. It was theorized that Captain Finch's relief column had met with the same fate, or had been ambushed and wiped out by local tribesmen on their return journey. The journal was dismissed as the product of a mind broken by fever and the extreme psychological stress of the frontier. The Fort Sparrowhawk incident was officially closed, another unsolved and inconvenient mystery in the long and bloody history of the British Raj. But what really happened in that isolated fort, perched like a vulture on the sun-scorched rocks of the Khyber? Was it simply a case of mass hysteria, a psychological breakdown in a group of men pushed to their absolute limits by isolation, fear, and the power of suggestion? The frontier was a place that bred paranoia. The landscape was hostile, the enemy often unseen. In such an environment, the human mind, starved of rational input, can easily turn on itself, transforming the whisper of the wind into the voice of a demon, and the shadow of a rock into a lurking monster. It is a plausible scientific explanation, yet it doesn't account for everything. It doesn't explain the claw marks, seen by multiple sober men both in the pass and inside the solid stone walls of the fort. It doesn't explain how 50 men in the first garrison and 31 men in the second could vanish from a locked fort without leaving a single body, a single drop of blood, or a single trace behind. And it doesn't explain the chillingly consistent folklore of the region. The legend of the Pashocha is not a mere bogeyman invented to scare children. It is an ancient and pervasive belief throughout South Asia, an integral part of the subcontinent's spiritual landscape. Described in the Vedas and Puranas, some of the oldest texts in human history, Pashochas are malevolent, flesh-eating entities. They are said to haunt remote places, cremation grounds, and sites of great violence. To the people who have lived in the shadows of the Khyber Pass for centuries, the existence of such entities is not a matter of superstition, but a fact of life, a danger to be respected and, above all, avoided. Did Captain Alistair Finch and his men, in their modern, rational arrogance, stumble into a place where an ancient, mythological reality still held dominion? Did they become the victims of a supernatural predator that had claimed that piece of land as its own hunting ground for millennia? We are left with only 2 accounts: the neat, logical, and unsatisfying official report and a frantic, terrified journal that speaks of an impossible horror. The truth, whatever it may be, was devoured by the silence of Fort Sparrowhawk. Hey guys, thanks for sticking around for the after action. The story of Fort Sparrowhawk is a classic example of what I find most fascinating about these military encounters with the paranormal. It's the ultimate clash of cultures, not between 2 armies, but between 2 entirely different ways of seeing the world. On one side, you have the British Empire. At the time, it represented the pinnacle of industrial, scientific, and rational thought. They believed in order, discipline, maps, and logic. To them, the world was a thing to be measured, conquered, and controlled. On the other side, you have the ancient spiritual world of the Indian subcontinent, a place where the lines between the physical and the metaphysical are much more blurred, where myths and legends are treated as living history. What makes the story so powerful is that it places a man of pure logic, Captain Finch, into a situation that logic cannot explain. His entire worldview is systematically dismantled, piece by piece, until he is left with nothing but terror and a belief in the very nonsense he once mocked. It's a humbling story, a reminder that the world is often far stranger and more complex than our neat, rational models allow for. It speaks to the idea that there are ancient powers and old rules in certain parts of the world that don't care about our modern armies or our advanced technology. It also highlights the importance of listening to local knowledge. How many times in history, and even today, have outside forces entered a new land and completely dismissed the wisdom and warnings of the people who have lived there for centuries? The story of Fort Sparrowhawk is a terrifying allegory for what can happen when that respect is absent. Thank you again for listening to this deep dive into the folklore of the frontier. Your support is what allows us to keep unearthing these strange and forgotten stories. A huge thank you, as always, to my Patreon and YouTube channel members. May God be with you, no matter what you are dealing with, and I will see you in the next episode.